Welcome to another edition of One-on-One with Mitch Lafon. And joining me this week, the multi-talented Steven Wilson. We talk about his new collection of orphaned songs called 4.5. And we discover that when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. You'll understand what that means. So let's get right into it. Here is the one, the only, Steven Wilson. We are speaking with Steven Wilson. The new album is 4.5. Let me ask you about this album, because your albums to me have always been sort of whole. You know, they're thematic, they're complete. This is a collection of what I would call sort of orphan tracks. Mm-hmm. Does that present any challenges for you in getting them to sound good together and making it cohesive?
Well, certainly. I mean, you know, my thing has always been about, trying to create a satisfying musical journey, a satisfying musical continuum across an album. You know, I grew up very much with this idea of the album as a musical experience across, you know, what was, when I was growing up, across two sides of vinyl. But now, of course, we have to deal in CDs and streaming. So that kind of idea has slightly gone out the window. But still, I like the idea of structuring a listening experience. Now, that's easier. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's certainly easier when you're writing a collection of material that shares a theme and you have a kind of idea already about the kind of narrative and the arc that the music and the story will take. It's a little bit more problematic when you've basically got a bunch of songs that have been, I mean, use the word orphan, which I think is a good word, like orphaned from other projects. So they're not necessarily connected in any musical or lyrical way. But still, I worked hard to try and sequence it into a satisfying, listening experience, and I hope it does come across in that way. I mean, you use the word album. I mean, technically, this is not. I mean, I think of it as a kind of mini album because although, I mean, it's still pretty long. It's 35 minutes long, which certainly in the 70s or the 80s would definitely have been considered an album. It's a little bit on the short side. For me, it's not really an album. It's a mini album because it doesn't have, shall we say, that thematic unity that I'm normally looking for in one of my major album statements. So it's kind of an interim mini album, extended EP, whatever you want to call it.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of that in between, right? Because you look at an album from Aerosmith back in 1970, and it's like 28 minutes, and it's a full.
Absolutely, yeah. I know.
Yeah, so it's a little longer than an EP. Where do you see yourself now going in terms of the next full album? How are we progressing on that?
Just beginning to think about where I might go. As you probably know, because we spoke before, the one thing I'm always very committed to is this idea that to not repeat myself, and that every major album project should have its own, its own reason to exist. You know, I'm not interested in making another Hand Cannot Erase or another Insurgentes or another whatever, because what's the point, you know? So I'm always looking for something that would make each project very distinctly different from every other project. And I've got some ideas. I don't want to say too much about it now, except to say that I'm in the very early stages of writing and demoing songs, which I think are giving me a way forward. Yeah.
Now, it's interesting you say you don't want to repeat yourself. This album has Don't Hate Me, which was a Porcupine Tree song.
Well, no, let me stop you there.
Okay. It's a Steven Wilson song.
Exactly. It was never a Porcupine Tree song. It was a Steven Wilson song that was initially recorded by the band I was in at that time, which was Porcupine Tree. But it existed as a Steven Wilson song, and I demoed it as a solo song, and believe me, it didn't change that much from my demo to when the band did it. So to me, they're all Steven Wilson songs. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're kind of, if you're recording old songs or you're reinterpreting old songs, you're kind of reprising something you've already done. Now, that is true, but let me stress again, this is not a major album statement. This is an interim album. So I think I have felt like I was I felt comfortable the idea of revisiting some older songs. And by the way, I also feel that we have reinterpreted them in a different way, and they do sound different. I mean, this song does sound different to the original version, but it's not something I would ever consider doing on a, shall we say, a major new creative statement, i.e. album number 5.
Right. So we're not expecting a covers album from Steven Wilson at any time.
Well, I'm not ruling out doing that one day. Maybe reinterpreting, covers is probably stretching it a bit much, because they're not covers technically. They're just a different interpretation of one of my songs. But I wouldn't rule doing that out at some point. But let's just say that at this point in my career, I'm not interested in looking back, except to say that I am. Well, that's not true, is it? Of course, because I am looking back. If I'm taking older songs and I'm reinterpreting them in a live context, that is a form of looking back. But when I say I'm not interested in looking back, I'm talking about these core album releases. At the moment, I'm still interested in new music, new ideas, exploring new sounds, new combinations of music, and that's certainly going to be the case on the next major record.
Since we're not looking back, but these orphan tracks, did they become transformed from where they were in 2013 and wherever they come from to now, or are they just, these are the demos, and we've cleaned them up and here they are?
So a bit of both, actually.
Okay.
Some of the songs, a bit of both. Some of the songs are almost exactly as they were demoed, and some of them have been radically reworked subsequent to Hand Cannot Erase being finished and released. A couple of the songs, I mean, there's a song called Vermilion on the record, for example, and all I really had was a bass line. I had a bass line that I'd kind of come up with during the sessions for Hand Cannot Erase, and I never got any further with it. So when the idea came up for what was originally an EP and grew to be this, more elaborate mini album or album, I felt like I wanted to finish that song off and actually do something with that bass line. So I did a lot of work, and that, arguably that is, in fact, to all intents and purposes, that is a new song. But some of the other songs, I mean, the song called Happiness, which was demoed in 2003, originally, planned for an album called Deadwing, that my band Porcupine Tree recorded, but the band never did record that song. And what you're listening to on 4.5 is pretty much my demo, with my current band replacing, the drum machine with real drums and real bass. But that's it. Really. That's pretty much as it was written all those years ago.
In fact, let me talk to you about that song. First, Deadwing. That was your original concept, was to turn that into a motion picture, and that's been sort of on the back burner for 13 years now, I guess.
Yeah.
Where are we with that? Is that something you still want to pursue, or is it sort of like, yeah, okay, I wanted to do that, but I've moved on now?
It's kind of the latter, yeah, because actually I did sit down with the guy. Now, Deadwing has a very complicated history. It was originally written with my friend Mike Benyon, who was a guy who I knew in London at the time, who was making he was making TV commercials, and he was directing pop videos. But like all guys that are making commercials and pop videos, ultimately his ambition was he wanted to make a feature film. But he couldn't find a script that he wanted to make. So I said, well, why don't we sit down and actually write something and bring in all the elements that you want to bring to your first feature film, and we'll actually write it with all that in mind. And we sat down and we wrote Deadwing, fully intending that we would hopefully get the movie into production. Naively, one might say, because I don't think either of us really appreciated how difficult it was to even get people to read a film script, let alone actually finance a film script. Nevertheless, we went ahead and wrote this movie, and fully believing that we were going to get this movie made, I went ahead and wrote what I thought would be the soundtrack to that movie, which would have been my first solo record. So this is where it gets very complicated and kind of meta, to use a kind of modern term, because that Deadwing would have been my first solo record, because that would have been a movie score that I would have recorded for that movie had it been made. So we then spent the next 12 months trying to get people to read the script and to consider the script for making, and we never really managed to get anyone to commit to making it. We weren't looking for a lot of money, but still it was let's just say we could make it for a lot less money now than we would have needed then, because now you can make movies on our own, it's crazy. But then we were still looking for like a couple of $1 million to make this relatively low budget movie, and we never managed to get that done. So what happened subsequently is a lot of the songs I wrote for that, what would have been that soundtrack, that solo record, songs like Lazarus, Arriving Somewhere But Not Here, Happiness 3, Collecting Space, which was on my first solo record, they got sort of, channeled into these other records. Myself and Mike sat down a couple of years ago and we read that script again because we thought, okay, well, now we could make that movie for a lot less money. And we kind of both felt, you know what, we could probably write something better now. And that's not to say that we've got around to doing that yet. But
And here's where life started throwing lemons at us. The Skype connection that we were on died a sudden death, but Stephen and I were determined to get this interview done and get our 20 minutes of scheduled time completed. So I got him right back on the phone, and we did it again. So we cut right back into part 2 of Steven Wilson talking about his new album, 4.5, and all kinds of other things. Here once again is the one, the only, Steven Wilson. I just want to ask you a couple more questions, and then we'll call it a technology day, and we'll move on. Right. We were talking about the movie, and you mentioned Happiness 3. Now that's a song that has sort of a, I don't want to call it a pop flair to it, but it's a sort of a lighter sound.
Yes.
Would you ever consider making a pop album and try to, head up the charts and be number one on, Billboard's top pop songs? I mean, is that something that interests you, or does music have to be more cerebral?
Well, you know what? That's complicated. But listen, I love great pop. I grew up listening to the cerebral, to use your word, stuff. I mean, I grew up in a house where I was listening to ABBA, the Bee Gees, Carpenters, the great pop of that era, and the 80s as well. I occasionally, when I write what is something you consider a more direct pop song, I'm incredibly proud of it. I don't think it's what I do best. No, let me rephrase that. It's not what I do naturally. But occasionally I do come out with these great pop songs, or not great, but songs that feel at least convincing to me, whether it's Lazarus or Postcard or Happiness 3. Occasionally I'll come up with one of these songs and think, yeah, I'm really proud of that. And it seems really kind of immediate and not, not something that you need to sit down, furrow your brow to and kind of engage with on a deeper level. It just has an immediacy to it. Would I consider doing a record like that? Absolutely. But I wouldn't do it for the reasons you mentioned. I would do it because I genuinely wanted to do it. I guess I'm a bit cynical now because, you know what, I think even a song like Happiness 3 in 2016, as regards mainstream radio is concerned, still sounds avant-garde. Do you know what I mean? I think 20 years ago, a song like that would have been a kind of shoe-in to get on radio playlists. And yes, you might have had a hit single with it. But you know what? Listen to mainstream pop radio now. Does a song like Happiness 3 really fit into that? No, I think it's in this day and age, even a song like that, which on the surface seems very accessible, very immediate, sounds like, it sounds like Metal Machine music compared to what gets played on mainstream radio. So I'm not holding my breath. Even my most accessible mainstream friendly songs, I think, still are too much like square pegs trying to fit into a round hole as regards, modern pop radio is. So, listen, I would love to make a record with more succinct, direct, accessible music and songs. But that's because I genuinely love great pop, not because I would be doing it in a careerist sense. And I don't believe that I would have much success in trying to do that anyway. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Right. Well, it does. In fact, I boil it down to if it's
Mitch, we lost you again. I can't
hear
you.
No, I'm here. I'm here still. There you have it, folks. Because losing Steven once wasn't enough, I thought we'd do it a second time. So we are again troopers determined to finish this. We've got a part 3 and a part 4, so coming up. So hang on for that, and let's get this right. Start it again. Here is part 3 with Steven Wilson.
Okay, good. Fabulous. We might have to quit while we're behind here.
Yeah, but all right. I'll finish off with 3 rapid fire questions. I'll go with and there you have it, folks. Part 3 of my attempted interview with Steven Wilson. Technology. Great that it connects us, but sometimes it just frustrates the ever daylights out of us. So we gave up on Skype and moved over to the telephone, and unfortunately the results weren't much better. So here is quickly part 4, and then Steven and I just said, hey, that's it, that's all. We are done, and this interview is what it is, and it will live as this technological blotch, if you want. So here we are, part 4 with Steven Wilson, now on a cell phone, and enjoy, and I hope you got something out of this. Here's Steven Wilson again. I want to ask you about some of the mixing and mastering that you do. You've got Jethro Tull's Aqualung coming out in April that you've worked on. When you approach a project like that and an album of such stature, in fact, how do you approach it? Do you see it as a fan and you just want to make it better in the fan set of mind, or do you see it as an artist who's creating something new, or do you? What exactly is the way you approach an album like that?
Okay, well, firstly, that particular project I did 5 years ago. That's a reissue. They're reissuing it now, I think.
Right.
That was something I did for the 40th anniversary. The only difference is this time they're not using the original mastering that was done. Which, you started off your question by saying I want to talk to you about the mixing and mastering you do. I don't do any mastering. I do remixing, and what's I suppose significant about that is I actually bypass mastering completely. I do it with my own records, and I do it as much as possible as I can, as long as the artist is cooperative with these remixes I do. I don't like what mastering engineers do to my mixes. I'm not saying there isn't a job for mastering engineers, but for me personally, when I've finished a mix and it comes out of my studio, I don't want anyone to touch it again. It's exactly as I want it. Now, that said, to answer the second part of your question, you know what? It depends on the album. Some of these albums sound fantastic already, and really all I'm trying to do is match the original stereo mix so that I can go on and then do a 5.1 surround sound mix, which actually is the way this whole process started. I didn't sit down, and no one sat me down and said, we want you to do a new stereo mix of any of these records. They said, we want you to do a 5.1 mix. And I said, well, okay, the first thing I need to do then before I go on to do a surround mix is to match the original stereo mix as closely as possible. And in doing that, we started to realize, I say we, I mean, this is some of the early projects I was doing, which were mainly with King Crimson and Jethro Tull. We started to realize that we could actually get some extra clarity out of the stereos. And we were listening to the new stereo and the old stereo and realizing there was also something to be gained in issuing the new stereo mix. Now, not always. I have to say, Aqualung is one of the albums which really did benefit because it wasn't particularly well mixed originally. It sounded very muffled, it's a classic record, but it's a classic record despite the sonics, not because of the sonics.
And with that, Steven and I decided to scream out, no mas, no mas, no more, no more. We cannot keep going. So thank you to Steven Wilson for being so very patient, and thank you to technology for helping us make this a wonderful and memorable moment. Check me out, folks, at Mitch Lafon on Twitter, One-on-One Mitch Lafon on Facebook, and, of course, head over to all of Steven's properties and check him out. The new album is 4.5. Always a pleasure to talk to such a musical genius. And with that, folks, I say thank you for listening. And thank you for staying with me on this one, because I know it was kind of a tough one. There you go. And hey, bye for now. Cheers.